Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skills. We'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive.
Good afternoon. I am very excited to have Kirstine Stewart on the Venture for Canada podcast today. Kirstine has a wealth of experience across many different sectors, including holding senior roles at the CBC, a wide variety of startups and scale-up companies, and the World Economic Forum. Kirstine, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks,
How are you
Scott.
doing?
Great to be here. Good, thank you. How are you?
So one of the things we were chatting about in the pre-show was the importance of self-awareness and how it's often correlated with success as a leader. Why do you think self-awareness is such a critical leadership trait?
Great question. And I think it is probably maybe the most important character trait of a successful leader, because I think you can't figure out how to lead others. You can't understand how to motivate others unless you understand yourself. And I think it's also in that way also important for you to understand what your impact is on others. And so that takes a huge amount of self-awareness. I think, those that there's a lot of, I think, people who think that they are self-aware, but really they're more self-involved, I would say, or self-reflective, not necessarily self-aware. I think, people who understand very well what their impact is can make adjustments according to the situation that they're in. I think people who are self-aware can be more flexible and in understanding their kind of footprint and their effect on others, I think can be so much more motivational, and it can be so much more impactful in the decisions that they make, because they're not being arbitrary. They're not being self-involved in a way that is putting, self first. I think someone who's self-aware is a little coming from a place of a little more understanding, and there's a humility to what your understanding is of your place in the world. Biggest driver of success is having a team around you who believes in the vision that you're setting out, and you can't get people to believe in the vision that you're setting out if you don't understand what motivates them or connects them to your story.
I've recently been reflecting on the phrase that we are each our own worst enemy, in the sense that we sabotage ourselves. And often I think, and I reflect on my own self, as I would view sometimes my biggest enemies as like other people in the past. But often the biggest thing holding myself back is me. And I think that, to your point about self-awareness, it's so critical to understand, in what ways are you as an individual holding yourself back, and what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, how can you improve as a person, and recognizing that you're not perfect, no one is, and it's this constant kind of work in progress. So to the point about kind of next steps or actionable kind of takeaways for listeners, what are some of the ways that you think somebody can cultivate this sense of self-awareness?
I think, again, it's as you said, it's kind of running through a list of what your own attributes are. Like, what is it that makes you tick? What is that makes you happy? What skills do you have that you feel have the best impact on others? And what can you do to hone those skills? Where can those skills be applied? I think sometimes it's interesting because even how you function in a role is one thing, but how you kind of function through life or move through life is another benefit of understanding who you are. I often get asked, oh, you had such an interesting career. You've had so many different, great jobs. And, how did you know that you can move from one to the other? Or, I've made transitions from traditional spaces into really interesting new spaces. And I think what I drew on was, again, an understanding of what I was good at, what made me happy, and what made me happy was being able to do things well. Like those two things were kind of connected to each other. And, I had a really specific skill set when I came out of school that would not necessarily be applied to, these technology jobs that are sitting out there now. And yet I've had the luck of having an amazing career in a space that I was not officially trained for. But I think it was, again, in understanding what were the factors that made me successful in the role that I was in. So let's take as an example, being in traditional media, storytelling, understanding audience, understanding what motivates people, connects users, if you want to call them users instead of audiences. Like, those things are all transferable skill sets, and the values that I had, that I believed in the power of storytelling, that I believed in the creator as someone who brings value to the world, and to those around them. Like, whether you're in publishing, or whether you're in a social media platform, like, those are values and skill sets that are true in both places, in all places.
The world is constantly changing. And I think, to your point, one of the ways that somebody can enhance their adaptability, which is another core kind of competency, is that sense of self-awareness. Like, how can they adapt themselves to rapidly shifting circumstances? So kind of shifting gears a little bit to your career, and you have an excellent book called Our Turn, which I really enjoyed reading in researching this interview. And one of the things I found really interesting in the book, one of my favorite parts, was you describing the very beginning of your career. So you graduated from University of Toronto with a degree in English literature. And to your point, you gained this kind of very specialized knowledge. And then in your 20s, you ended up working in the film sector broadly. I've probably described it a little bit differently, but generally film sector. And you started in an incredibly kind of entry level role. Like, that was sort of typical. It was very, but within a couple of years, you rose extremely quickly kind of within this company. And you describe, entering as basically the ground floor, and then end up, rising to basically become the boss of this company in a pretty short period of time. What advice do you have for a young person on how to quickly make that transition from an entry level role to rapidly kind of rising up in the ranks at the early part of one's career?
Sure. That's a great question. And I think it's one that I get asked the most. And that's the thing that I think most frustrates people, and particularly in the beginning parts of their career. They know they have the capability to do so much more. They know they can bring value. And ultimately, I think, maybe for this generation, even more than my own generation, when I was coming into the workforce, 20, 30 years ago, there is even less dependency or less value kind of hung up on a title or a certain salary. It's more about, like, I want to know that I'm contributing in my daily work and actually being recognized for what it is I do. And so I think it's a couple of things. It's obviously, there's a combination of, as they always say, preparedness and right time, right place. I think it's important to seek out areas which have fast growth. If you want to grow fast within a business, you need a business that is growing fast. It is very hard to displace or make moves in areas that are pretty entrenched, and I don't necessarily mean traditional, because sometimes traditional places can also move quickly. And sometimes the newest places can actually be quite entrenched. So I think it's a matter of understanding and really checking out where you're stepping into, and is this a growth area, because then you can grow along with it. And I think then beyond that is understanding, how am I bringing value to this organization or place or industry, and is it in a part of the business that's valued? Is it recognized? There are some areas that you can get into that are very crucial to a business. There are other areas that are more kind of the backbone, but not necessarily those that are, going to help you have a light shine on yourself. So I think understanding what your skill set is, getting into an area or a business that can make best use of it in a way that needs you the most, I think is probably the best way to kind of align, in as much as you can align anything for your own growth potential.
trait of self-efficacy and the skill is often assessed by different kind of like entrepreneurship, like researchers, as one of the most like important traits for like entrepreneurial success. That in essence, to believe you have the capacity to accomplish a task or succeed in an endeavor is something that's so critical. And I think a lot of young people often struggle with that. They don't believe it. And if you're listening and you're a young person and you're having sort of self-doubts, definitely the advice of believe in yourself while sounding trite is something that's really, really actually critical, particularly at the beginning of one's career. One other thing you said, Kirsten, that I think really stuck with me was around, I think when evaluating career options is thinking about almost this Venn diagram of, are there positive tailwinds in the sector? And to what extent does the role align with your skills, passion, kind of, et cetera? And if you can find something in between, that's a sweet spot.
There's your sweet spot. Absolutely. And, throw in there some values. I think the other thing too is you can be deeply unhappy in the middle of that sweet spot if the place you're at doesn't now then also support what you think is, a worthwhile existence. Like there's that on top of it, which is, that sounds incredibly foreboding, but there's actually huge opportunity in that. Like when you find the right place, because there's a lot of opportunities that will check off all those boxes. But if they don't check off that last box, which is, do I feel happy here? Do I feel comfortable here? Am I aligned with where this business is going? All of those things, in the checking boxes above that list don't matter if that last box doesn't connect. So add that to it as well.
A lot of people ignore their instincts. And I think that often, if you go a little bit more with your instincts, at least reflecting in my own life, I think a lot of the biggest mistakes I've often made is when I'm convincing myself to do something, when I'm pushing it away.
Absolutely. And I always found it was my first instinct, which was the right one. And I always kicked myself later for convincing myself otherwise, right? Or talking myself out of it. Yeah, but I think that's also one of those, when you say, important thing is how we can get in our own way. Sometimes we get in our own way by not listening to ourselves and, not if the alarm bells are going off or there's a red flag. And I think sometimes too, we're all, I think, hopefully humble people, in that if we're thinking that all those boxes are being checked, then who am I to say that, we always hear that saying, when someone offers you a seat on the rocket ship, you turning it down, you'd be crazy. But maybe that rocket ship is pointed in the wrong direction. It's not pointed where you want it to go. So it's, I think, definitely listening to your own instincts. And even if it's a matter of, asking a few more questions or checking things out to make you feel better, but not necessarily convince yourself of something against something that you instinctively feel is wrong, but maybe it's something you're just not hearing that makes you feel great about it yet. Maybe you have to ask more questions. I know I had to do the same in my own career, especially in working with these startup companies. The presentation of them, and companies are very good. They're trained to be able to pitch in a way that is convincing.
Glassdoor is a fantastic resource, which 15 years ago didn't really exist. And now if you do check a company and they have 60 reviews and they have like a score of 2 out of 5, it's kind of like, okay, we're going to do a little.
Maybe my instinct is right. So what's going on here? Yeah.
There's more transparency. Mentorship is another thing that you talk about in your book. And in particular, you talk about, and I am probably mispronouncing her name a little bit, but Ismay Benny. Ismay Benny, and the role that she played as both a friend and mentor for you. Can you talk a little bit about how Ismay specifically helped you in your career path?
Absolutely. Well, I was literally like 19 years old, graduating from university, in my first job, as you described, and Ismay was my first boss. And, I think what's also interesting is, when we talk about opportunities, and particularly women are encouraged to, look for mentors and people who can help guide them through a career. Sometimes other women are not necessarily seen as the best version of those mentors, which is unfortunate, because who else is going to go through similar experiences to you than somebody who looks like you and sounds like you and comes from your kind of a place in the world. So it's um, I was really lucky to find someone like Ismay as my first boss, because she was very matter of fact. Her version of assessing somebody was on the role that you did and your performance, and she was also growing a business at a time when so I was in international distribution, television distribution, content distribution at the time, and she was a builder in that world and really global. And so opened a lot of perspectives to me, not just doors. And I got to see a lot of the world in those jobs, from when I was just a girl Friday in my first job to being a sales executive in the second role I had there, to heading up some sales divisions. She was always there to encourage and recognize when I was doing well for the company. And because she was building, she had a need to bring somebody along, and so I was lucky to be that person. I think we talk about mentorship a lot, in that I think we sometimes tie a little bit too much of our hopes and dreams on a mentor, or an advocate who will speak for you or kind of train you or coach you. I think it's incredibly important. It may have a huge influence on my life, but there's also like a number of people who, whether they're your boss or whether they're your colleague or whether they actually are on your team, sometimes I think you can learn from everybody who's around you. And I think you have to be very open to that and not just look for these highly placed mentors who you believe will magically open doors for you. I think that's a lot of pressure to put on a relationship.
I think your advice, Kirsten, makes is super critical. And it's interesting also in the scientific research on mentorship is that while there's a strong while there's a correlation between career success and having a mentor, it's not super strong. I think people think that, they have a mentor, it's just going to fix all of their problems. And that's often not the case. And the other point I think to mention, which I think is really critical, is that the most successful mentorship relationships are inherently two-way. Like the mentor learns a lot from it. It's not extractive. And I think some people will approach mentorship relationships of like, oh, what can I get out of this relationship all the time? And if you're a really successful mentee, you should be thinking about how can I add as much value to my mentor as well to make it a two-way street.
Absolutely. I think I've learned probably more from the people who would be considered like more junior to me in my career than myself at the time. But that's really important. Like today, I'm still learning from people who are on my team or who are on other teams who would not necessarily be at that, if you want to call it, level. But that's important. I think you need to be open to always learning, always being curious. And I think, we talked about personality traits, the self-awareness is what you have to be aware of, what you don't know, and where you have gaps and what you need to fill in. And that constant state of improvement and growing is learning from people, not just those aspirational ones like you mentioned, because those are important to kind of understand what success looks like. But the path you take along the way can change. And I think sometimes too, the idea of mentor fixates you on a certain outcome. When you talked before about being too tied to outcomes, I think you have to be ready for the world shifting very quickly and not necessarily getting to the outcome you thought you were going to get 5 years ago when you built that little 5-year personal plan for yourself. So it's important to, again, have that kind of committee, that advisory board, that de facto advisory board of people who can also help you spot where, because they know you best and they're going to recommend for you what your future is. They don't necessarily know your future, but they can help you make your decisions as you move through a really kind of interesting and sometimes complicated time.
The point about becoming not too attached to outcomes and as it relates to mentorship is something that I think is so important. I think a lot of young people start their career and they'll pick somebody or a group of people and they'll say, I want to be that person. And first off, they don't necessarily know all of it's not always as good as it cracks up to be, first off. So if you fixate, maybe that's not what you actually want. That's been a personal kind of evolution to some extent. I think that the second thing to your point, Kirsten, and as we were talking about in the pre-show, is the world is just changing, so rapidly that becoming too attached to any kind of outcome, I think, can it actually can really reduce someone's resilience, because if you become so attached to achieving a specific goal and then you don't get it, it just devastates. And I think that I see this with a lot of young people. Is I think a lot of times our education system, our society, de-emphasizes the journey and emphasizes the outcome,
the goal. Yeah. And I think goals have to be flexible. I think, again, when people say, oh, you've had such an interesting career, would anybody in their right mind give up the head of the CBC job to go work for 140 characters in an app, which is what I did when I left the CBC and went to Twitter? But you could see the future. You could see where things were moving, and I actually was not. I didn't make a bad step in making that move, because that's where the future was, and that's also where I knew my skills could be helpful and where I could learn. And so that state of always being curious, I think, is very important. While you understand that you could sit in a role, you can decide that's your goal and your lifelong, and maybe and all power to people who have a really specific ambition and want to be only that, and have a really definitive focus and one goal for their career or a profession or some such thing. I think that's wonderful. But I think for a lot of us who aren't necessarily overly skilled in one particular area, that ability to be flexible and kind of rise with the shifts and changes of the marketplace is incredibly important.
So one thing that you talk about in your book, and I'd say it's maybe it's kind of the thesis of your book, Our Turn, is about how women are particularly suited to lead in this kind of information age. Can you elaborate a little bit on your thesis in the book?
Sure, and I think it kind of stretches beyond the characteristic of being female. I think it's are you someone who can be attuned to the way things are moving and changing, and particularly communication. In Our Turn, what I try to emphasize was that there is a certain kind of leadership that just doesn't work anymore. And the book was written about 5 years ago, so things do move, but it's surprising how much of it is still kind of relevant today. That traditional corner office, and I think in some ways described as what you think today as more VC or finance, kind of attributes of leadership, being kind of command and response, and being more traditional in the kind of hierarchy of leadership just doesn't work anymore. And that ability to approach leadership with flexibility, if business success measures have changed, and they have, then the way that you lead those businesses has to change as well. And so whether it's my own, I can only write from the experience of being a woman, because that's what I am, but there are, I believe, a number of people who feel that they have been left out of the leadership race because they didn't fit a certain attribute, which was that more kind of traditional, white straight male corner office leadership, top down style. And I think there's new opportunities there. And I think there is new opportunity for this different form of leadership, because the business metrics have changed, because the information world moves so quickly, because we need adaptability, empathy, a number of traits that were not necessarily valued in the way that they are now. It does take a different kind of leadership. And so as a woman, I found there were, definite places where I would have had skills that would have been considered soft skills and maybe not as valued in a previous incarnation, that were much more valued today.
The command and control style of management, which was, definitely seemed like it was prevalent in the past, or more so, is definitely going out the door. And I think Gen Z and a lot of young people are really expecting and I think not just Gen Z, I think everybody is increasingly expecting managers to be coaches and to be very empathetic and
to support growth, right? Like I think the whole point is this is teamwork ultimately. Like this isn't a matter of I'm not going to be taking your orders. Maybe your orders are wrong. I need to be, these new generations coming in are like, I need to challenge the order that I just received because, I have a different perspective, and, and And that again goes back to, you know, what do people value in their job? Are they valuing a title and the salary, or are they valuing their impact? And I think the new generations coming in really do understand that they want to be valued. It was fascinating. I read a report this morning as we were talking about the Great Resignation and what has happened over the last couple of years, whether the resignation was forced because of situations or whether it was a decision because they realized they didn't want to keep living in the way they've been living. Those that lost their jobs over the last 2 years have largely gone into new roles that pay much more. Great Resignation has actually empowered a lot of people, and they're coming back into new roles that are better aligned with what they wanted to do, and surprisingly, they're getting paid more for it as well.
Agreed, and I think shift to a lot healthier kind of work as well. I think that the pandemic opened up people's eyes that work is work. It's not the entirety of life, and I think that there's other things that that are important kind of as well.
And there's so much that you're not in control of.
Yeah, exactly. Kirstine, it has been a true pleasure interviewing you today. We talked about a really wide range of topics, from mentorship and personal advisory boards to how you can deal with the uncertainty of the world through self-awareness and foster adaptability. I really recommend that our listeners check out her book, Our Turn, which is easily can be purchased online. It's a fantastic read and a lot of great lessons. Kirstine, it's been a true pleasure interviewing you today. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Scott. I really enjoyed this. Thanks so much.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.